Welcome to the Stanfords Travel Podcast. Mapping your travels since 1853, Stanfords is the world-famous independent map and travel bookshop based in London's Covent Garden. Thank you for joining us on this little podcast adventure.
Here we are, and welcome to Breaking Barriers, Hilary Bradt's Life in Travel. Please welcome to the stage Hilary Bradt and Simon Calder.
Hello everybody, and what an absolute joy it is to be here with Hilary. And I'm going to be asking her questions for about half an hour about her extraordinary travelling and publishing and writing career, most notably with Taking the Risk, which is on sale at all good Stanford stands over there afterwards. You can get a signed copy. And then you're going to be able to ask Hilary questions of your own, and we'll be wrapping up at 2:45. So very nice to see you. Hilary, last year was the half-century anniversary of the very first Bradt Guide. This was backpacking in Peru and Bolivia. To the immense credit of Bradt, I know that the top-selling 5 books in Stanford's at the moment for guidebooks, 2 of them are Bradt titles, which is remarkable. At 1974, I know that none of you were actually born then, but I was, and it was so exciting to see these new guidebooks to what was then an extraordinary part of the world. Very, very few people ever ventured to Latin America. It was extremely expensive, and if you were thinking of going to Peru and Bolivia, well, there were massive political problems going on there. You bring out your first book in 1974. What qualifications did you have for that exactly?
Absolutely nothing, because I was an occupational therapist. I'd never worked in an office before. I had no clue about money except how to save it, how to travel on $5 a day. And so we just winged it. But actually not knowing what we should do was a huge advantage. We did everything a different way, and it worked.
Well, yes, but it's one thing to go travelling, and I'll get on to what drives you, what sparks your desire to travel in a moment. But to travel and then publish a book about it, that was quite an investment of time, energy and money for something you had no idea was going to succeed.
Well, actually, it wasn't much investment in time because we were stuck on a river barge. It was a lovely way of being stuck, but we were travelling down a tributary of the Amazon.
That was in the olden days when Amazon wasn't a rival to excellent bookstores, by the way.
When it had watery tributaries rather than business tributaries. But so we lay in our hammocks because it was the only place we had to relax, and we wrote our little book. And that was my former husband, George, and me. And we sent it to my mother-in-law to publish. She printed 2,000 copies. It was very scruffy, and it sold. And we thought this is rather fun, so we did another one.
And you've been on holiday ever since, which is excellent. But what drove you to go off and explore South America, the Andes, at a time when, frankly, nobody else was? It was just a complete blank on the map, wasn't it?
It was, and unfortunately my absent-mindedness is sometimes very useful. And I was a passionate theatre fan, and I was deeply in love with Laurence Olivier. And, we're going back to the 60s now. And so I would go to everything that he was in. And he was in, at the National Theatre, a play, The Master Builder. And so I booked tickets for it, but I got the wrong night. And it was actually a preview of a play called The Royal Hunt of the Sun. And some people here may have seen it. It's a wonderful play by Peter Schaffer. It's about the Incas that I'd never heard of, and Atahualpa, Pizarro. And I got just hooked on the idea of seeing the Incas, seeing the remains of the Incas, going to South America, which was a completely new idea. And 2 years later, or 3 years later, I got there.
Can you tell us the nuts and bolts? So, of course, these days, you want to go to Peru, you want to go to Bolivia, that's fine. You probably have to change planes in Madrid. Good luck with that. But that's actually going to be the scariest part, trying to get your way across Barajas Airport. Tell us what it was like in the early 70s.
Well, the only guidebook then was called How to Travel Without Being Rich. And you might remember this, actually, do you?
I wasn't rich enough to buy it.
The thing is, it covered the whole world, and so it wasn't terribly detailed, but it did talk about the main trade routes, the main highways, and I learnt about the Pan American Highway and travelled down there. My first trip was 1969, and I got to Machu Picchu and got to Cusco, fell totally in love with South America. So when I met my husband, George, I persuaded him that we would go back there. And there was never any question of going anywhere else. I mean, it is a wonderful continent.
And you were on the Pan American Highway. Were you actually hitchhiking at that stage?
We were when I was travelling on my own. I didn't hitchhike. I caught buses, but with George and I hitched whenever we could. Mostly in South America in the 70s, you didn't hitch because there weren't private cars, or there were very few. Chile and Argentina were different. We hitched there. And as you know, you and I are the oldest hitchhikers on the planet. And I'm going to get this in case Simon's too modest. He asked me when I last hitched, and this was 2 years ago when I was 82. And I asked him when he last hitched. He said, last week.
Well, except I need to confess, it was disaster. I checked actually. The last 2 times I've hitched, I have failed miserably to get a lift. First one, the most recent one, last week. I was in the west of Ireland, and it was one of these things where the bus is coming along in half an hour, so you try and hitch, and obviously people have better things to do than pick me up. And then before that, I was in Somerset again, and the bus comes along, and you get on that eventually, which is ignominious, I think. But you say we're the only 2 hitchhikers on the planet left over. That's not strictly true, because Tony Wheeler, who's the founder of Lonely Planet, is also a hitchhiker. I know that for a fact because I was out walking with him in Berkshire last summer, and we had to get somewhere, and we got a lift from a very nice chap, and so that was all good. So there are 3 of us. I think we also organise a hitchhiking race sometime soon. Ha! You would win because you're the most glamorous.
Going back to the difficulty of hitching in Western Ireland, that was my least successful hitch. But I was hitchhiking with a horse.
How does that work exactly?
It didn't work. I was trying to cross the River Shannon, and I thought an empty horse box might come along, and it didn't. But it's all in another book of mine called A Connemara Journey.
Well, and that's, there we are. If you're ever tempted to hitch from one side of the Shannon, which is very wide at that stage, to the other, then you are unlikely to encounter a horse box. Although there's nothing wrong with optimism in travel, it's absolutely essential. There you are, you're publishing your first guide. Tell me about the first review you got. Not from a reader, but say in a quality newspaper.
I happen to have it with me.
Really? Extraordinary. What are the chances?
What a coincidence.
Wow.
Because, it was someone called Elizabeth de Strumelo who wrote in the Daily Telegraph, and when you're a new publisher, to get a review in the Telegraph by a proper reviewer was absolutely wonderful. So it was a book called Backpacking in North America. And she just says, yes, I started my reading, I can't even read, I'm so old, my road roaming in the United States, and I wish Hilary and George Bradt had been around in those days, because I can't imagine a more delightful vademecum. But the reason you've happened to ask this question, 1979, the first review was... you might not think that there was enough to say about hitchhiking to fill a book, but Simon Calder has managed to do this in the Hitchhiker's Manual, Britain. Vacation work, £1.75.
There we are. Thank you. Right, and I don't know if they've got any on the Stanford stand. It might be slightly out of date now, but that's very, very kind of you. Well, what a great honour to share a review column with you. But you were also in, and you talked wonderfully about how great it was to travel in Latin America, but you were also in Colombia at the height of the violence, the civil war there. Are you mad?
Colombia was just about our favourite country in South America. The people were marvellous. They spoke the clearest Spanish, and my Spanish when I first went to South America was gleaned from Californian place names. So I know words for tall stick and the angels and a few things like that. It wasn't terribly useful. And the Colombians spoke beautiful Spanish, and which really does make a difference. And they were so funny. They were so kind. I don't think... Oh, we were robbed. We were robbed 4 times. Which was
4 times in Colombia?
In Colombia.
But I would have thought by, say, crime 3, you sort of were out of stuff worth nicking, weren't you? Or how did that happen?
It does look like carelessness. The first time I had all my clothes in a little suitcase, and we left a woman to guard them, and she might possibly not have guarded them very well. Anyway, they disappeared, and that was wonderful. I only had the clothes I stood up in, and it was a great relief because I washed them quite regularly, and I had less to carry. And actually, my rain gear was in my backpack, so that didn't go. Other things disappeared at other times. I had to hijack a bus at one point to frisk the luggage boy, who we were sure had taken our stuff from the top of the bus. And unfortunately, I think we got the wrong luggage boy. And it was very embarrassing. And I don't think I've ever been so humiliated and laughed at so uproariously than by those bus passengers.
Oh, no. Having stuff stolen is bad enough now, but we're living in a sort of digital age. Then it must have been an absolute disaster.
No, it was Swiss Army knives when you carried them because they didn't get confiscated at the airport, and that was a nuisance. Earlier times, and this is relevant, it was our very precious South American handbook. And I have to just say that Bradt is now publishing the 100th anniversary South American handbook this year. So it's a very nice circle because you couldn't do without the South American handbook in the 1970s. There was nothing else, and it was wonderful.
And this was printed on Bible-thin newspaper, and people would find someone with a copy of it and copy bits out. That's what I did anyway, because, again, I wasn't rich enough to buy travelling without being rich, and I certainly wasn't rich enough to buy the South American handbook.
I know that some people rolled a joint with it. I'm sure you didn't, but it was just the right paper for that.
Oh, anybody in from the drug squad? Let's talk about, and in this marvellous book you tell many, many great stories, taking the risk. Can you recall a great day of travelling, your best ever day of travelling, and, also your worst day of travelling?
Well, I know one thing that people often ask me is the worst border crossing.
Oh, okay.
And actually, we somehow, there's no good story in our bad ones. They were just rude officials. But going to Uganda in 1976 was a very nerve-wracking experience because that was Idi Amin's Uganda, and we were in what was then Zaire, which is now the Congo. We were let out of Zaire, and so we were in no man's land, and we had no idea if we would get into Uganda. We'd heard that Amin had banned whites for coming to Uganda then because there'd been an assassination attempt and he wasn't very keen on the British. And it was just wonderful because as soon as we got there, just speaking English after Zaire was such a relief. And it was, welcome to Uganda. No, we don't need to search your luggage. There's just one problem. And we thought, oh, God. He said, there's no bus to Kasese for an hour or two, so one of our men will take you. And, I mean, the book describes a rather bad experience right at the end of our trip, but the rest of Uganda in 1976, despite our min, was wonderful.
Well, this is very, very reassuring. And if I may, a couple of Slavic border crossings I've made, which have been quite weird in Eastern Europe. Actually, this was going back to 2018, 2019. So first of all, going from Eastern Hungary into Ukraine, which of course was fine then, you look on the map, you find the last station in Hungary, you think, okay, well, I can walk from there across the bridge, but you turn up and the border guards say, sorry, you can only cross in a vehicle. And so they say, you have to hitchhike. And they order you to hitchhike, which is great, obviously, from my point of view, and obviously yours. I was with a couple of pals who were not so comfortable with it, but it worked a treat. And then, and this was Russia in 2018, when it was the World Cup, I went to Kaliningrad to see Croatia play Nigeria. And coming back, my mate thought I'd booked the bus tickets, and I thought he had, so obviously we had no bus tickets. And we got the train to the last stop, where there was an army officer who said, what are you doing here? And we said, well, we're trying to get to Poland. Thank you very much. Kaliningrad is this wonderful little Yorkshire-sized bit of territory that's pinched between Poland and Lithuania. And he said, oh, okay, well, I better drive you to the border then. And he dropped us off and said, you've got to hitchhike from here. So that's twice officials have ordered me to hitchhike. And then a bunch of very happy Croatian fans came along. They had just beaten Nigeria 2-1. So they picked us up and took us to near Gdansk, from what I remember. So that was a day that that went from very good to very bad, or no, very bad to very good.
From very bad to very good.
Okay, now we need to know a bit more about the nuts and bolts of travel guide writing. In particular, do you have special places that you leave out of your guide books because either you don't want to spoil them or you actually think it's really not worth going there? So are there secrets that we need to know about?
So just to summarise the question, because
it was more a kind of James Joyce style stream of consciousness. So do you, when you are publishing guidebooks, do you leave some places out because you don't want to spoil them, for example?
It's actually because I've been involved in 13 editions of our Madagascar guide, so I have a lot of experience with that. And people do ask me, do you ever leave anything out? And I can think of two occasions. One is where we went to an absolutely remote village with a guide because he didn't know what to do with us. And the people had never seen tourists before. They were perfectly civilized, but they'd never seen tourists. And when we got there, this was in eastern Madagascar, they were having a meeting with their leader about community work. And the leader was persuading them that they needed to work for the community, and they were gradually getting all the young men on board. And they did that. And then the kids all came streaming out of the school, and they just stared at us, and we knew enough Malagasy to say, what's your name, and so on. It was a wonderful experience. Now, if I'd mentioned that in the book, tourists would have gone, and tourists, unfortunately, unknowingly, changed remote communities immediately by giving presents. They feel that, we're so rich and they're so poor. We'll give the kids sweets because children love sweets. We'll give them pens. It instantly changes children into beggars. And I can't change the whole world. So by not mentioning that particular village and another even more remote community, also in Madagascar, where we were supposedly the only white people they'd ever seen. And it was humiliating for us. We shouldn't have been there. It was, it's too long a story to tell here, but, the man there had never seen a water bottle. He didn't know how to do a screw cap, but he was given a plastic bottle of water. His life will have changed forever, because before that he collected water in snail shells. So I think, I get quite pedantic about this. I think the effect of tourists on remote tribes is quite negative, but I think it's a wonderful plus on wildlife.
Okay. What have you eaten around the world that has surprised you, either in a good or a not so good way?
Well, you know, I'm quite an adventurous eater. The most disgusting thing is quite a common thing, and that's in Chile, and that was sea urchin. And it's absolutely revolting. I mean, it's so disgusting. I couldn't even swallow it. A tasty thing, but a very sad thing, was woolly monkey in Panama. I know, and it was stretched out. It looked exactly like a roasted baby. It was, I mean, we had to eat it to be polite, and it was good. But that was, I've never forgotten that little thing being roasted.
Oh dear. And to wash it down, what would you be drinking to help you with something indigestible like a sea urchin?
Well, again, the most revolting, and I'm sure lots of people have had it, is Inca Cola. And it looks and probably tastes exactly like urine. It's the national drink of Peru, and it's really disgusting. But otherwise, like you, Simon, I was too poor to afford anything more expensive than water with water purifiers in it. But I do now like beer.
You were rich enough to have water purifiers. That's extraordinary. Well, very, very pleased to hear it. One thing I need to point out about your excellent book is that on page 134, if I'm not mistaken, there is an account of how to save money on car rental. Can you share this secret with all these people?
Well, I'm very impressed that you remember the page number. Yeah, you see, we weren't very rich, despite being able to afford the book. And sometimes you absolutely have to hire a car, because there's no hitchhiking doesn't work because there's no traffic and there's no public transport. And, you know, I'm a good traveller in that I'm desperate to see really interesting parts of the world. So George and I wanted to explore Big Bend National Park in Texas, and we had to hire a car. And it was nearly right out of our budget. Once we got to the park gates, we'd already spent more money than we can afford. And then to hire a car, you had a flat rate, and then per kilometre or per mile. And so we looked at the mileometer, which was going horribly up, and we thought, if we drive backwards, I wonder if it goes down. Well, it does. And so we entered Big Bend National Park, no traffic, drove 10 miles backwards, 10 miles forwards. Of course, it wouldn't go past the zero. And we'd done a plausible enough mileage that it wasn't questioned, and we paid a lot less. And actually, it's been very good. I mean, we did it again in Patagonia. I wouldn't do it now because I'm too bad at reversing.
Do not try this at home. Don't try it anywhere. That's absolutely shocking. Anybody in from the Texas Highway Patrol? Worth saying, driveaways. Anybody done a driveaway if you really want to save money on car rental? Anybody done that? Oh, there we are, a young lady there. This is fantastic. It's a bit of a minority sport, a bit like standby flights these days, but you pick up a car. I managed to get an MGB in Miami, Florida, which needed to be driven to Medford, Oregon, and you're given sort of 11 days to drive it. You get fingerprinted, and this was before fingerprinting became fashionable, and you just drive this car. You pay for the petrol, but everything else is entirely free. And anybody like MGs? Because mine was a complete heap of junk, I realised before I'd got as far as Orlando.
I must say, this is drive-away cars, isn't it? And this was the thing when George and I were travelling. And you'd get a Cadillac, you'd get an Oldsmobile. I mean, it was like driving a sofa. It was terrifying because there's so much in front of you. But we could sleep in it, so it was very cheap.
Did you drive it forward or backwards, mostly?
Forwards, because I think a zero mileage on the mileometer might have looked suspicious.
Right. We're shortly, 5 minutes, going to open it up to the floor, so think about your very good questions. I'm fascinated. Here we are, so many opportunities. You can go to the ends of the earth here. Is travel better or worse than when you started?
I want to ask you that because we've both been travelling about the same time. I mean, from my point of view, it's different. It would be smug and wrong to say that it was better in the olden days. I mean, you and I travelled on such a small budget.
You were buying water purifying tablets.
But we very rarely stayed in good hotels and so on. And it is rather nice, actually, to travel comfortably. Now I'm in my 80s. I think I've earned comfortable travel. So in that respect, it's different. And for me, actually, I don't sleep on people's doorsteps or on buses that go for 24 hours without reclining seats. So I think it's better, Simon.
Well, I tell you what else it's better. If you know the beautiful Chilterns where you live, it's a beautiful part. But just watch out for Hilary driving backwards. I think travel these days is so much better in pretty much every respect. We've got wider horizons. We can crucially travel much more safely than ever before, and it's much more affordable. I mean, my children don't hitchhike because, well, they did when they were very young because they didn't have any choice. But they don't hitchhike because why would they? You've got lots and lots of choice, and just crossing Europe is something which would have taken 3 days and been really miserable and quite risky. Now it takes 3 hours and costs the equivalent of a day's work, maybe at the national minimum wage, and you've got all the wonders of digital technology as well.
Well, that is the thing, isn't it? It has taken the serendipity out of it. When we travelled and when you travelled in your youth, you couldn't pre-book places because you didn't know where they were. So you got out of the bus station and you checked around the hotels and you stayed in some place that probably had fleas or whatever. Now you go on the internet, you go on to TripAdvisor, you know exactly where you're going to stay. But if you hitchhike, you don't know where you're going to go or who's going to take you, and that's the thing about hitchhiking.
That is very, very true. I'm not a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of Bradt Travel Guides and indeed other travel guides. I'm not a huge fan of TripAdvisor because you don't quite know where everybody is coming from on that. So I will stick to guidebooks and just walking past places. And hitchhiking is very good. Although I might have failed in Ireland this time, but last time I was there, I was in Skerries. Anybody in from Skerries? Beautiful fishing port just north of Dublin. I was running for the train, and I was obviously going to miss it. And I was still 300 metres from the train, and a woman pulls up, throws her door up and says, "I'll take you to the station," and drove in about 30 seconds, and I made it. And that was the miracle of the train, and I got to beautiful Malahide, which is also lovely. Do you have a travel philosophy, which you've got exactly 2 minutes to tell us about before the excellent members of the audience begin?
No.
We got a feel for
I
it.
will. I mean, I've already said, do no harm to rural people, do as much good as you can to wildlife.
But for example, do you have a particular part of the world, or are you more drawn to places which perhaps have less wealth and benefit more from tourism?
I suppose I like the road less travelled, and I really do. I love it when I'm on my own. I can look at what I want to look at and do what I want to do, and I do enjoy that.
So I will infer from that we're never going to go travelling together. Anyway.
I'm going to remind you, before the questions, you in The Independent put out a prize that the person who did something was going to go on a hitchhiking holiday with you. I've never asked you how that went.
It was very good, yes. So every Christmas on The Independent, although other excellent newspapers like The Times and the Sunday Times are also available, we have a kind of a prize that writers give, and this was to hitchhike to Berlin with me, and it went very well indeed. It was her grandmother, she was very nice. We got the most stupendously good lift from somewhere in central Netherlands pretty much to Berlin in a Mercedes. It was just like one of those impossible things. And then and this is going back to analog travel, in a hostel in Berlin, we met people who said, what you want to do is have a look at this special day ticket on German railways, and you can go anywhere you want to on a Sunday, and it's Sunday tomorrow. And we managed to get back actually by train. So yes, but you should have bid more money, then you would have got me. Anyway, that's a different presentation. So who would like to ask a question of? And here comes Matt racing towards us. I think that's him racing. Who would like to ask Hilary a question? You can ask me a question as well, but she frankly will be a lot more interesting. Well, I've got plenty more questions here, thank you. Here we are. There's a lady there.
Hi, I love travel guides. I'm a tour manager, I use them all the time. But what is the future of travel guides with, people not necessarily publishing lots of books, lots of things online? I mean, I hope they exist forever, but I do worry about what the future of travel guides.
Yes, so just to restate the question, I guess if I might sum it up as, do travel guides have a future? Because lots of young people, even younger than you, will think, I'm going to Tallinn, I'm just going to see what I'm going to do online, as opposed to buying a very good Bradt Guide to Estonia by Neil Taylor. So is there any future, or is it just, unfortunately, people like me, and frankly, we're not going to be around forever?
Well, I must say, I'm hugely encouraged by the crowd around our stand here at the moment. I think this is a time to bring up the subject of Socotra, because I think both you and I have been to a place that no one's heard of. There is no information on the internet. There is a wonderful new Bradt Guide, because I managed to get there in 2020, had to crowdfund that book because 2020 was COVID, we were going down the spout, and wonderful crowdfunding, people supported it. We produced this beautiful book with a lot of experts. I can say it was beautiful. You're going to point it out.
I'm trying to, yes.
Later. And it's just in its second edition. But I think that sort of explains why there is a future for guidebooks. If they're of a place that isn't described accurately on the internet, or where there isn't another guidebook, that's going to be a Bradt Guide, and that's what we do.
And the two guides in the top 5 are Uzbekistan and Albania. And Socotra is not in the Chilterns, if you were thinking it was. I'm just going to try and show you. It's owned by Yemen, so it's over here, and it says here on the map, which you can't actually read, and I don't want to move that because things would go badly wrong. It says Socotra, and it's in red. It was British once, but it's not anymore. It's Yemeni, and it's going to be a wonderful place to travel to one day for mass tourism, I think. But meanwhile, if you want to go there, there's a very good Bradt Guide, and I think the first ever crowd-funded guidebook.
Simon, it's a wonderful place to travel to now.
It is a wonderful place to travel to now. I was slightly...
Fantastic vegetation, beautiful scenes, unspoilt people, wonderful.
Sorry, is this the Chilterns? We're on. Okay. No, Socotra was great, except...
Simon, I don't live in the Chilterns now.
Where do you live?
I live in Devon, but Bradt lives in the Chilterns, so you're right.
Yes, thank you very much. Anyways, but Devon is easier to reach and possibly safer. It's not on the Foreign Office no-go list, as far as I know. Is it? Another question, if you would be so kind.
I guess the answer to this question is no if you're on the 13th edition, if I got that right, of your Madagascar guide. But do you ever worry about what you're going to find when you go back to somewhere that was quite remote 20 years later?
Do you ever...
I heard that. Well, let me just make sure I heard it. Sort of, if you go back to a place you love many years later, how has it changed? I think I have been doing that, with Madagascar and Peru, because I led treks to Peru for years and years and years. And The local people did change, unfortunately, because previous people before us had given them sweets and pens. So there were thieves where there'd been just curious youngsters. But it was easier and actually cleaner. I mean, Machu Picchu, which I first went to in 1969, was, I'll put it politely, covered in human feces. The Inca Trail was. Now it's clean. You know, the number of people who do it is limited. It's very, very busy. We were the first people to describe it in print, and we kept going lost. So places are cleaner, they're safer. The people have been changed, not always for the worse. You know, they're more savvy about tourism, and if they're very used to tourists, they're very helpful, and they speak English, which is quite helpful. So yes, there are good and bad, but I think, you know, it certainly wouldn't stop me going back to places I love, and I've never been terribly upset. I mean, Madagascar, the deforestation is upsetting, but the number of NGOs, the conservation bodies that are working to improve things, it's encouraging. So you always have the good and the bad mixed.
And are there places you would advise, Hilary, that we go to before it's too late? So is Uzbekistan, is Albania going to be changed in the next, say, 5 years? And should we get there soon before it is? So that we can see that kind of certain rawness that appeals to you and certainly me as well.
Was that a question?
Yeah, was that a question? I'm not going to make a living as an interviewer, am I? So, how can I rephrase it? I won't at this stage ask for help from the excellent audience. But how can I phrase it? Are there places that you want to say to us, go there now?
Got it. Sorry, it's not you as an interviewer, it's me as a deaf old lady.
Socotra, there we are. Okay. Anybody in from the Socotra Tourist Board? Very good. Another question. There was somebody, the lady there. Just here we are.
I seem to remember when I first started travelling when I was young, that, for instance, the rough guide used to be delightfully rude about places. And I'm wondering if that has now been lost to some degree for many reasons.
Yes, guidebooks being rude about places. In the sense, I imagine, of if and certainly this was the case with Lonely Planet, they actually made a kind of almost a marketing campaign out of when they brought out a new guide to Britain. They would almost deliberately put in something saying, don't go to Blackpool, it's rubbish. And then the mayor of Blackpool would get upset and they get loads of publicity. What do you reckon?
It's a good question, actually. In my early editions of Madagascar, I had a section called Perspectives of Madagascar. And I quoted right from the 17th century, people who'd loved the place and people who'd hated it. And I included letters from travellers. In the olden days, we got actual handwritten letters. But, you know, I would have 50 or so about Madagascar, so I could really do the quotes. Now, we're much more circumspect, I think. You know, it's... we warn, we have a health and safety thing. You know, certainly Colombia, we'd warn about the thieves because they're very accomplished in Colombia. There's apparently a college for thieves in Bogota, 3-year course, quite a stiff course. So, so you have to warn about that. But, you know, I would never say don't go to a place because there's always something positive about a place.
Okay, and maybe we'll ask for suggestions for places which very little positive can be said. I mean, I was involved in writing guidebooks myself, and I did one to Cuba where basically for the food, and we're talking here about the early 1990s, I think I had to say, if you want to lose weight, go to Cuba. The food is awful, which it was, and thankfully no longer is. So another question.
What's been your best ever what has been your best ever Bradt Guides seller, and why do you think it was so successful?
I think the question is, and thank you for that, which has been your most successful guidebook which has sold out?
And why?
And why? I can answer that, and I can answer the why, but it's not a very nice reason. In 2001, we published a guide to Iraq, and 3,000 copies were bought by the Pentagon. I think I can guess why, but we were very pleased to have that success.
Goodness. Bradt has always rather done that. You've been first into places. And you've also, and this is talking very peaceably, only guidebook publisher I know of where you've actually got His Majesty's man in Riga in Latvia, Paul Brummel, the ambassador, writes a guidebook, which I think is a fantastic thing, both for the diplomatic service and also for the traveller.
Yes, we've had ambassadors, we've had royalty, we've had...
Royalty?
We had...
Can you tell us?
HRA's Princess Michael of Kent wrote a book for us. Not a guidebook, but about cheetahs.
Wow, okay, gosh. Well, if there's anybody in from Buckingham Palace, you know who to approach about your next book project. Very good. Any more questions?
Would you go to a country that the government advised against?
I think we might. Can you? I think that was which country would you advise against?
Would you go to any country that the UK government advises against going?
Right. Okay. This is a very good question because would you go to any country the UK government advised against going? And I know that for a fact. Of course you would because you've been to Socotra, which is in Yemen, which is on the red list. Do not go.
We specialise in that. I must say, once Bush Senior talked about the axis of evil, we immediately did North Korea, Iraq and Iran. So, absolutely. And going to Socotra against Foreign Office advice was very expensive. I'm surprised you could afford it, actually, Simon. But because just the insurance was expensive. So
you were insured?
I love it when we're told not to go somewhere.
Well, yes, and there is the interesting point that going to somewhere on the no-go list is going to invalidate a normal travel insurance policy. But I'm afraid the Foreign Office consular advice lost all credibility during COVID when, at one stage, because the Department for Health under the marvellous Matt Hancock was just deciding arbitrarily, along with the marvellous Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, which countries we couldn't go to that week. It was kind of roulette of where will we go, let them go next time. At one stage, they managed to persuade the Foreign Office to say, right, anywhere we put on the amber or the red list, you've got to say don't go to. And so you had this ridiculous situation where Portugal was rated the same as parts of Kabul in Afghanistan. So I'm afraid at that point they lost all credibility and they haven't done much to rescue it so far. But do remember, we're not giving you advice to go to places where they say don't go. And I mean, Somalia, I've not heard great things about. I mean, I did a series called 48 Hours in Great Cities and 48 Hours in Mogadishu. I think I would be cowering the hotel.
Yeah, I haven't been to Somalia. We've done a guide to Somaliland, but I haven't been to Somalia.
Somaliland, of course, one of those countries which doesn't exist, so the Foreign Office can't say don't go there. I think we've got time for one more question, if it's snappy. Any more? Okay, well, I've got one more question, which is, to what extent, you did reveal that you're in your 80s, to what extent are you disenfranchised from travel because perhaps you're not on the same technological plane as somebody who's 20? So everything from, for instance, I'm going to Singapore tonight, so you've got to, of course, get your permission in advance online, otherwise you're not getting on the plane. And we saw loads of that during COVID. But is there anything where you think, 20-year-olds would be having a different experience now?
All the time, because they do social media and I don't. My next trip, actually, which is very foolish given my age, is skiing in Austria. And I can't ski, and if I fall over, I can't get up. But I'm sure it'll be all right.
I'm sure it'll be all right. That will be the follow-up title for the marvellous Taking the Risk by Hilary Bradt. She'll be publicising it on TikTok in no time. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the marvellous Hilary Bradt for her time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Stanfords Travel Podcast. You can find us at stanfords.co.uk and follow us on social media at Stanfords Travel.